When I first started out playing Warhammer 40k, I made myself some ruins out of shoeboxes and leftover cardboard. I threw them away years ago, but I never got around building new ones, except for my Kill Team Gameboard. But I also needed some ruins for my other gameboard. So today, I'm going to show you how I built these ruined buildings, fitting for a lot of wargames, in my case sci-fi systems, but with some tweaks you could also build it for fantasy settings. The first thing I did was to sketch out the ruin ideas I had in my mind. I also wrote down some measurements because I knew I wanted to use certain pieces from my bitbox. I then started building the bases. I wanted my buildings to be on an elevated base that collapsed because of earthquakes or bombardments, so I drew out where the leftover basement had to be and glued down supports for the base plate to glue onto. With wall filler, I then imitated dirt and rubble that piled up to the ruined space. It's important to use wall filler that doesn't shrink, otherwise your base might warp. After that, I glued on the ruin's cork base and gave both bases a coat of watered down wood glue. I also teared off some cork pieces to give the base a more crumbled appearance. Yes, I bought silicon, and I used it to make molds from some Necromunda bulkhead doors that are no longer available, that I then recasted from plaster. I don't really like the idea of gluing expensive and high quality GW parts to my otherwise cheaply constructed terrain pieces. And I think recasting in this case is alright, because as I said, GW doesn't sell these bulkhead doors anymore, and I'm not doing that either. But enough of that. I then began drawing out my walls on some foam board, using one of the bulkhead doors as reference for my measurings. For the window arcs, I just traced the edge of a water cup. Just make sure your cup has the right size and you marked out where the arc begins and where it ends. Then I realized that I screwed up my measurings, and to compensate that, I added a 0.5 cm thin strip of foam board to the bottom of my wall. Next time I'll just sketch out my wall in a 1:1 ratio so that I don't screw it up again. But at least you can see my mistake in the final product. To get the distance between the windows and the ruin's corner right, one of the two walls has to be shortened by the wall's thickness, as you can see here. I made the floor from some leftover foam board pieces. I went on by cutting foam board strips that I then glued to the outer walls of my ruins to give them some volume. I also covered up the ruin's corner by gluing 2 foam board strips together, the way you can see me do here. Then I used hot glue to cover up some seams. Moving forward, I cleaned up my plaster castings and later glued them to the foam board walls using hot glue. It would have been better to use some kind of thick wood glue because hot glue doesn't stick very well to dusty plaster surfaces. But on the other hand, I had to fill in the uneven back walls of my plaster castings, which the hot glue did very well. Using my knife, I cut down foam board pieces that were too long and also began adding battle damage. With hot glue, I then glued the walls onto the base. I simulated bullet impacts with the kebab stick and some bigger impacts with my knife. I also cut out bigger wall pieces to imitate some tank shell impacts. For rebar I used mosquito netting, but I will start looking for an alternative because this stuff is way too thin for representing rebar. To glue the netting to the wall properly, I sandwiched it between the wall and some paper. I wanted the ruined walls to be quite thick, so I glued cork to the inside walls. I never actually used cork before, so I was happy to try it out. I quickly measured out the size of the wall sections and then cut my cork plates into the right length. I went on dry fitting the pieces and if needed trimmed them down even more. While dry fitting, I also traced the window openings onto the cork and cut them out. I dry fitted the cork plates again, then glued them into place using wood glue. I also weighed them down to be sure they get glued on. To get the impact holes in the right spots, I used a needle to pin through the cork, so I knew where to rip pieces out of the cork walls. Because I did not want to waste any material, I used different cork pieces for one area. I tore pieces off of them or just changed them around till they fitted nicely. I also glued tiny cork pieces into some bigger cracks, as you can see here. On other walls, I cut out one big piece, then ripped it apart and glued both pieces on the wall with a tiny gap between them. Again, gluing cork grain where the cracks were too big. Another way of making concrete cracks is to just mark out where you want one and to then carve it out using your trusty knife. This method has the advantage of not showing through what's behind the cork. It also makes the crack look really rough. So far, the ruins look like this. Oh, let me just fix this floor right quick. Now just tear off the excess cork and voila! On one ruin, I wanted to add a partly collapsed floor, so I dry fitted some foam board, cut it to size and glued it together. Coffee break. For detailing later on, I did not only make molds of mentioned bulkhead doors, I also molded some other pieces I temporarily put together from GW bits and plasticine. Some barrels, some ornaments for the walls, a screen panel and other things. My inspiration for making these bits came from a video of the channel Berserkerworks. Link to the video in the top right corner on the video description below. I bought this silicone for 30 euros. This particular product has to be mixed in a 1:1 ratio. I just mixed it together properly and poured it into the molds from a bit higher up to kind of get rid of some air bubbles in the silicone. To calculate how much silicone I needed, I used a formula from a tested video about molding. To get there, just click the button in the top right corner or click on the link down in the description. I either calculated the mass wrong or my silicone has a different weight than the one the tested guys used. In the end, I had way too much silicone left in the cup, so I improvised. These are my finished molds. They turned out quite nicely, but they still needed a bit of cleanup work. As I did with my bulkhead doors, I also cast the other bits and pieces from plaster. Just be careful demolding your plaster pieces. They are really fragile. Don't look too shabby. I cleaned the pieces from overhanging plaster using knives. Now I could start gluing the final plaster details to the ruins using wood glue. I wanted to connect these two pieces with a cable, power source and monitors. So I drilled some holes into them, glued them on a wall and then glued a piece of old guitar string into the holes to connect them. Looks nice, doesn't it? Back to the wall filler. To cover up some visible hot glue and to give the ruins more life, I wanted to make rubble piles. I put down some wall filler and then threw on some broken plaster pieces and differently sized sand onto it. I also stuck some barrels into one of the rubble piles to add even more detail and some cover. To make the walls look like they are one solid piece, I also put some filler and sand on some seams between the layers. To fix the rubble piles in place, I covered everything with watered down wood glue. I base coated both ruins with some grey paint I had mixed up from white and black acrylic paint. I diluted the paint quite heavily with watered down wood glue so that it would flow into all the nooks and crannies and give some more rigidity to my rubble piles. As you can see here, there were a lot of spots that I could not reach with my big brush, so I painted all leftover areas with another, this time tinier brush. I also gave the lowest areas of the base a brown coating to later represent earth. Here you can see the base coated ruins. In my opinion, the grey is way too dark, but whatever, I just wanted to get things done. The next step is to dry brush everything. So I added white acrylic paint to the grey paint I used for base coating and started dry brushing both ruins. After intensifying the highlights, I brushed on a layer of black wash to emphasize the shadows. My wash basically consists of way watered down acrylic paint. I think like 1 part paint to 20 parts of water, but it depends on what color you are using and how much pigment it has. So you should test your wash before you go all in. My wash also has some airbrush thinner and dish soap mixed into it, but I think just using dish soap should be good. I kind of forgot to pick out the barrels and the screen sections, so yeah. The barrels get a red coat and a white stripe around them. I didn't really cover up the grey base coat, so everything looks all grimy and dirty. The cable was also painted red, and the screens got a nice green color that I tried to kind of add a glowing effect to. And now onto the dry brushing again, now with an even brighter grey than before. Also notice that I mostly brushed down to imitate light hitting from above. I then gave all metallic parts an overbrush/dry brush of some gunmetal. Also the barrels got a thick coat of black wash resembling leaked out oil. To create some rust, I just stippled on black, brown and orange paint with a tiny piece of a sponge. The last finishing touch is to dry brush the brown areas with a kind of light brown beige color. I used this last step to blend both brown and grey together. And here you have it, the finished ruins. It's amazing how much detail you get when dry brushing on several layers of paint. And now, here's some shots of heroic space marines defending these ancient broken down ruins against some hungry tyrannids. Well, I hope you learned something, and I hope you liked this video. I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. Please check out all the links in the video description, subscribe, and goodbye.